Hi, welcome to the Center for Sexual Assault Survivors presentation on grooming. We're going to be talking about what grooming is, what it can look like, and some support for people who have been victims of grooming. This presentation is being given by the Center for Sexual Assault Survivors. We provide support for survivors and anyone who's been affected by sexual violence. We provide free and confidential crisis counseling. We also offer a women's and men's support group, and we also have a 24/7 crisis hotline for anyone who needs immediate support or just somebody who will listen to them, somebody to help them talk through some things. We do have trained advocates on staff to help with our crisis hotline. And then we also do different community and outreach events. I want to start by first giving the definition of sexual violence. So sexual violence is an all-encompassing, non-legal, kind of umbrella term for any type of sexual behavior that happens without a person's consent. So that can include sexual assault and rape, and you can see there are additional examples of what could be constituted as sexual violence, but it's important to remember that if somebody felt like they were violated in any way in regards to sexual activity, then their experience is valid. But I want to focus on that key part of the definition of sexual violence, which is that it happens without a person's consent. And I'm sure you've heard the term consent before, but what does it really mean? As you can see here, the short and sweet of it is that consent is a very clear agreement between people to engage in some kind of activity. So in this context, we are talking about sexual activity, and it's something that is clearly stated and understood by every party involved. So someone who is incapacitated or asleep or in another vulnerable position cannot consent, and minors cannot consent as well. And it's something that is always ongoing, so just because somebody agrees to one activity doesn't mean that they've consented to any other activity. And it's also never given under manipulation or other kind of pressure, so nobody should feel pressured to do anything because a forced yes is not consent. So that brings us to the topic of this short presentation, which is grooming. So the general definition of grooming is that it's a process in which someone is attempting to build a relationship, trust, and emotional connection with somebody so that they can then manipulate, exploit, and abuse them. And this can happen to anyone. It can also happen when online or with someone that is known to the victim or a stranger. So the relationship a groomer builds can also take different forms. This could be a romantic relationship, it could be as a mentor or an authority figure or a quote-unquote celebrity figure. I'm sure most of us have heard about the R. Kelly situation, and it's also something that can happen online, as we'll see later, when celebrities are able to interact with fans in a much more streamlined way, or it can be a dominant or persistent figure in a person's life. And it can also take place over one conversation or over long periods of time. And I want to highlight this here, which is that anyone can be groomed and anyone can be a groomer. So often when we think about grooming, we tend to think about it in the context of children or teenagers, but it's important to remember that grooming can happen to adults as well. So no one is immune to grooming, but technically there are some that can be more susceptible than others, including minors. But in reality, grooming has a great deal to do with gullibility, insecurity, trust. I remember watching the Surviving R. Kelly documentary, and there was a part that mentioned that he looked for the person who looked quote unquote out of place or standing alone. So the groomer may just target somebody who is isolated. So again, there's no single profile of a grooming victim or perpetrator. It can be anyone. So while we mentioned that the relationship that a groomer takes can look different, there are some common tactics that are often used. And it often starts with friendship. They will look for various ways to get in the victim's favor, which could be just bringing up some mutual interests that may have been expressed on social media, some name dropping of acquaintances, or even emphasizing their own influence or power. So they don't jump right into the abuse, which is often sexual. The groomer will try to get to know them personally by asking about their life, and it may actually seem like very normal social interactions, and in most cases they are. And that's why intent is so important, because the intended goal is some act of exploitation, manipulation, or abuse. So perpetrators will also use favors and promises to build trust. So building that friendship encourages the person to then let down their guard and think of the perpetrator as a mentor or a friend or romantic interest. And this can happen through secret sharing or offering some kind of help. Or they might share something that only the victim can know and then expect something in return to even the playing field once they've put on that show of trustworthiness. Groomers will also try to isolate victims from their own support system and family, and this is not something that is always obvious. It can be something that is very careful and tactful and approached from a need for companionship. So you can see here those phrases like, I'm worried you don't like me anymore, or I just feel so connected to you, or you're the only one who understands me. These phrases might be used to then reel their targets in closer. So typically, groomers will try to keep relationships with victims extremely private from the beginning, and this can actually make victims feel a little bit flattered and special, and therefore inclined to keep these interactions a secret. And then by isolating the victim from their support networks, it makes it easier for the groomer to then maintain control. So this is an example from Rain, and they have a few stories on their website of people who were groomed. And in this case, I wanted to share Adam's story. So, with his situation, it started out as harmless interactions with his uncle. He grew to trust him until one day those normal activities they did together turned abusive. And this was very difficult for him because, he built that trust and he was struggling with reconciling those feelings of love and, care with the abuse and emotional pain that his uncle then inflicted on him. So, you can see in the example that Adam's uncle used gift giving. He would take him to expensive sports events, sneak cigarettes that would end up being their secret, and then once he built that relationship, he then used it to abuse Adam. So I put this story here because it's important to recognize that it does often start out harmless from the viewpoint of anyone else, right? We might think, oh, well, that's nice that they're spending time together. It's good that he has someone to talk to, but there was a different intent behind his uncle's reason for getting so close to him. So after building this friendship or trust, the perpetrator will try to desensitize the victim to touch and the discussion of sexual topics. And this is to introduce them to the idea of sexual contact or to start out with harmless touches so that they are then desensitized when it does become more sexual. After that, they'll attempt to maintain that control and abuse. They may use threats or guilt, victim blaming to enforce that secrecy, and they may also try to gaslight the victim. And gaslighting is when somebody tries to make the victim or another person question their sanity or memories or perception of reality. So a simple example of gaslighting would be, let's say you made plans to meet up with a friend and they never showed up, and you remember very clearly making the plan and them agreeing to it. But the friend, when you ask why they didn't show up, they repeatedly, say that they never said that. They say maybe you talked to someone else because it wasn't me. They say that they don't remember that ever happening. And then despite the fact that you remember it very clearly, you start to question your reality and your memories and if you even really did make these plans. So while in reality the gaslighter does remember, they are adamant about this denial for the purpose of making you question yourself. So in the context of grooming, this can also look like denial when you confront them, or they may tell blatant lies or other things to get you to keep what's happening a secret, or to get you to question yourself. I also want to touch briefly on online grooming because, again, so much of our lives are online. Online grooming can happen in any sphere digitally, whether it be through social media like Twitter or Instagram, or gaming sites like Twitch or YouTube, or really any site where people can communicate with each other. And it's also easier for online predators to lie about who they are when online. So the goals of sexual predators in online sexual abuse or grooming is to inevitably get the person to send or post sexual photos for the perpetrator, participate in sexual activities by using a webcam or smartphone, engage in sexual conversations, or to even meet in real life. So they'll use the same tactics that we talked about before. It might look a little different just based on the interaction being online, but they are still trying to build that trust, establish that secrecy, and maintain control. So the example that I have for this one is one that happened early January of 2021. So this was a situation where a popular YouTuber or somebody who is a content creator for a living, Call Me Carson, was accused of grooming one of his fans. And this person came forward to reveal that she had been groomed. So it's important that we go back to what we mentioned before about power dynamics, because groomers can sometimes use those differences in power, or, I bring up the situation of R. Kelly a lot as well, but people can use their celebrity status to build trust much faster because they may already be a fan. They may already like this person or this person's content or consume their content. So it can lead to a greater power imbalance, and also it can make it a little bit easier for the perpetrator to gain that trust from the other person. So you can see in the sample screenshot that was revealed that he's using those tactics that we talked about earlier. He's saying, I have a hard time not thinking about you, my brain got stimulated and now it wants more. So it also has that desensitizing to the discussion of sexual topics. And also throwing in the I'm thinking of you, which can, of course, make the other person feel special. So again, those same tactics that we mentioned before, it's just that the interactions are online. So the impacts of grooming can be very traumatizing. Some people may not even understand that they've been groomed. As we saw in Adam's story, they may have these competing feelings like admiration, loyalty, and love that can then conflict with feeling fear, distress, and confusion. But grooming is a methodical and intentional process of manipulating a person to a point where they can be victimized. And this can have devastating effects on a victim's ability to trust. That sometimes slow process of building that trust and secrecy as normal can make it hard for both victims and the victim's acquaintances to recognize grooming for what it is. So it's important to be patient and understanding. If someone felt that they were pressured into doing something or felt uncomfortable, then that is valid and their experience is valid. So the video on the next slide will provide a little bit more information about grooming and sexual abuse as a closer to this presentation.
When a person manipulates you to gain your trust, it's called grooming.
And grooming can happen to anyone, but it doesn't happen overnight.
And by the time you realize something's wrong,
you feel like you can't stop it. Senior Pastor Paul was the head guy at my church. Everyone loved him. Because of him, I wanted to be a church leader, so I talked to him whenever I could. When he picked me to be his assistant at church, my parents were so proud, and I could see my whole future ahead of me.
Thanks for the help again, Lucas. I'd be lost without you.
He was a great mentor. We talked about guy stuff and growing up and life, and everything made sense. He made me feel smart, and when I felt lonely, he could always tell. He was my friend. The church was my whole world. I wanted to be just like Pastor Paul. So if his long hugs made me uncomfortable, or his touches confused me, I'd tell myself I was wrong for feeling that way, because I trusted him. He was supposed to be right.
for me, the attention I got from my boss messed with my head, I thought I was supposed to like it. I was stoked to have a job and to be making money. But when my boss AJ was around, things got confusing. She'd get close and talk about how I was her best worker and favorite guy. At first, the attention was nice, and an older woman maybe being into me? Every guy's dream, right? She'd invite me to hang out in her office and gave me beer.
Sometimes Paul picked me for special work with him.
I've got some more work to do in my office. Do you want to join me, Lucas?
I felt important, even though when we were alone, he would do weird things. Sometimes when we were in his office, he would show me porn. He said it was to teach me about sin and temptation. When he touched me, he said it was a way for people to show love, but it made me feel sick.
AJ was my first boss. Fresh Pack was my first job. And money was freedom, you know? And I wanted to keep my job. So I played along. Until this one night, when I closed. Hey, AJ, nobody else is scheduled for the night shift.
No, it's just gonna be us. You'll keep me safe.
My shift was almost over when it happened. I wish I could say I wasn't freaked out, but I was. It was one of those moments where your mind just goes numb, you know? And I tried to get a handle on what was happening, but all that came into my head was, I have to go.
With Paul, it got to a point where I couldn't ignore my feelings anymore.
You remind me a lot of myself as a boy, Lucas. Here, I think you'll enjoy this.
I kept telling myself, he's my friend. He's supposed to be looking out for me. But what if that's not true? And nobody would believe me anyway. In that moment, I just wanted out. Stop! I'd heard stories about weird things happening with coaches or church leaders before, but it can be hard to see when it's happening to you. In the beginning, grooming just looks like friendship, because praise, attention, and even some affection can feel harmless at first.
AJ was my boss, so it felt like I had to keep her happy to keep my job. But even though the special treatment felt good sometimes, I didn't want to feel uncomfortable at work.
Paul made me feel important, and everyone trusted him, even my parents. And he was always supposed to be in the right. Even though he gave me responsibility and praise, the way he acted made me feel sick to my stomach.
No matter how much power someone has or what you think might happen when you say no, if they make you feel uncomfortable, they're in the wrong.
I told my parents and the police, and even though everything finally stopped, I still can't believe the power Paul had over me.
Even if it's gone on a long time, and you've gone along with it, you can still speak up for yourself, get away, or get help.
So when responding to a victim of grooming, it's important to be patient. I forgot to point out earlier that while grooming is often associated with sexual abuse, that isn't always the goal. It could be a boss grooming an employee to fill a narcissistic need for superiority or power. And so sexual violence or manipulation of almost any kind can be brought back to that desire for power and control. And so if somebody has been groomed, they have been through a traumatic experience and an extreme violation of trust. And so much like any other form of manipulation or violence, and in this case sexual violence, it's going to affect them. So when responding, it's important to normalize what they feel, normalize their reactions, let them know that there's no one right way to respond, and that whatever they feel, they're not the first, they're not alone in this. Remind them that you're there as a support system. Avoid those accusatory statements or anything that contributes to victim blaming. Again, grooming often appears harmless at first, and the point of that is to get someone to trust them and let their guard down, so that that person can then be victimized, and that is never the victim's fault. The onus of responsibility lies with the person doing the harm. So it's important to be trauma informed as well. Trauma changes the brain, and it's important to know that in traumatic situations, our brains react automatically to do what it thinks will protect us, and that's not something that we can control. So it's important to emphasize that whatever happened was not their fault. So in the end, grooming can be traumatic and have varied effects on someone, but it's important to remember, for ourselves and for others, for those of us who may have been through it, or those of us who know someone or have heard of it happening to someone, that healing is possible. So that brings us to the end of this presentation on grooming. This slide has all of our contact information. If you have any questions, or if you need support, or if you need information of any kind, this is where you can reach us. So thank you again for listening to this presentation.